enough at this point. I am Kevin Germino. I'm in Milwaukee and work with Quinn, the other video that's on, at a company called 7 Summits, doing Salesforce consulting. Been in Salesforce consulting for about 4-ish years and on the platform for a little while before that. So Jake asked me to come in and kind of talk about deployments a little bit and some of the delightful pain points that we've hit over the years. Also, I have my lifecycle and deployment manager, designer, or whatever, if anyone cares. So some of this might even be real. So just a quick background on some of the kind of core things. I'm assuming that everyone here has a baseline understanding of deployments, and you have different sandboxes and you push things up. But I wanted to kind of level set and put a few thoughts out there, make sure everyone's on the same page. The first one is version control versus org-based deployments. I use VCS and Git interchangeably because at this point, functionally Git is version control and version control is Git, but obviously anywhere you see that, you can replace the version or any other tool, Visual Source Safe if you want. They're all the same goals. So when you look at Salesforce deployments, you can kind of look at it as an org is your source of truth and an org-to-org deployment, or taking something, building something, committing it, and then using that commit and that version control set as your source of truth. So org-to-org, as I said, working in a sandbox, you deploy it from that sandbox to either a higher sandbox or production. This is by far the most common way of doing Salesforce deployments, perhaps second most common behind just doing everything in production, but where you're deploying, this is what most people do. And one thing to call out there is that any situation where you retrieve from one org and then deploy that package to another org is an org-to-org deployment. If you develop in your IDE, you commit all your changes, you push it all into GitHub, you have a branch, you merge the branch with the pull request, you approve the pull request, and then you use Ant or SFDX to pull it from a sandbox and deploy it to production. That sandbox is your source of truth, and whatever you have in version control is just notes for reference. So, think about where your changes are actually coming from when you look at what deployment model you're following. Version control is kind of the other side of that, where you are building changes. You're generally building them in a sandbox or a scratch org, just because Salesforce, but you're writing your code, you're building your changes, you're committing them into some version control system. You are packaging from that version control and then deploying that to higher environments and eventually production. This is the standard operating model for development basically everywhere but Salesforce. However, it's not that compatible without help if you're trying to use it within Salesforce, because we're generally developing in an org, we're not developing in a text file that you can easily commit and deploy. A lot of the changes that you can make are hard to get into text and commit, and these tools are not really built for admins who do a lot of changes in Salesforce. So when we use a Git source deployment, we're usually looking for enterprise tools or even at least scratch orgs and SFDX. The other thing is to look at tools. There's 3 main categories in how I look at tools. One is admins, just really change sets, org to org, the friendly UI, manual changes, and I think we all kind of know what they are, what change sets are. Developer tools, I would call just the category. This is primarily Ant/SFDX. This would also include deploying from IntelliJ or VS Code or any other thing that's giving you what is really a command line interface to the metadata API. The nice thing about this is it's included in the platform, so it's free and you don't need to buy anything extra. It's really flexible. You can use it as like an ad hoc org-to-org deployment or tie it into something using tools like Jenkins to have a really strong automated process. And you can store changes off the platform so that you're deploying the same set of changes to multiple sandboxes and a production org, or even just archiving for auditing purposes. And then finally, because the other two options all have massive trade-offs, there are a ton of enterprise products. The one that I've got the most experience with is Capado, but there's also AutoRabbit, Flowsum, GearSet, and probably a dozen others. These are generally designed to let you do source-based deployments with a friendly, customizable UI that admins can use. So it lets everyone and just about everything be committed and have a source-based deployment. Because they're big enterprise softwares, they give you advanced controls. You can automate things like running nightly unit tests or even deployment or even like deployment steps. They generally give you a way of tracking each step of a deployment and having like user stories and stuff so you can use it in place of Jira if you want to. But at the end of the day, all of these deployment options are not really different options. They're different UIs on the same core. Broadly speaking, no matter how you're deploying, you're going to hit the same limitations and problems from technical perspective of, you're going to see the same technical problems and limitations of Salesforce deployments. These are all running their own variant sometimes of the metadata API. So some of the issues that you can see and run into, and these are just a little bit sporadic, but some things that I've seen, and I don't know, we'll get into how you can avoid some of them at the end. The one thing to watch out for is just make sure you know what you're deploying. Especially if you're doing org source deployments, you don't have a pull request or any good change log that you can review and see what is actually getting pushed. That means if someone makes changes in the environment after you test, but before you retrieve them, you didn't test those changes, but they're going to production. This is fairly common in shared environments, and we just hit it last week where we made changes, we put them in, they got overwritten by someone else, and the production deployment was really nothing. Again, source-based deployments really help a lot with this. Make sure that you're looking at your metadata files, you're knowing what's in them. And this can include your package XML, but it can also, this is your package XML, but it can also include, things like the actual profile files or the custom objects or fields or things that you're bringing in. If you're not sure what is included in the deployment, look at the XML if you can, look at the files if you can, and just check to see what will actually go, or review the documentation. And then the other thing that you can hit in this category is any kind of monolithic component. You might think, so an experience bundle, for example, we deploy communities a lot at 7 Summits. We run into this all the time where there's this large collection of JSON files that describe a community. And if you want to deploy it, you're deploying the entire community, which means if you make a change on one page or you make, add a bunch of pages or audiences and you want to deploy that, if someone else is working on another page in that community, deploying the experience bundle will deploy all of it. And that can be good, or it can be a nightmare. Some things to watch out that are specific to change sets. Some of this I already covered, but the UI on change sets is terrible. So kind of tied into knowing what you're deploying. If you select something in a change set and then you hit it, so the change set UI is this standard Salesforce classic UI where it's a list of components. You select the kind of component, and then you can have the A to Z to narrow down your search. If you go to Lightning Web Components X and grab an X7S component, but then you go to H to grab a different component, you've lost the selection from that. And if you change component types, you've lost the selection. This makes collecting components in change sets very tedious and is part of why they're horrible. But it also makes it very easy to forget something important if you, out of habit, check, change page, check, add. The first 3 did not make it into the change set. Or again, mention that. And just the limitation here, something that's worth calling out is you can't delete anything with a change set. With other tools, you can do destructive changes where you're removing metadata change sets certainly don't have that option. Deploying profiles is fun. The biggest thing to watch out for is that Salesforce will only deploy permissions for other objects and elements that are in the same deployment. So I've seen people run into this all the time. I've run into it plenty, where you want to add a bunch of access to, you're adding a component and you want to add access to an object for a bunch of users. You update the component, maybe you add some Apex, whatever, you update the profile for accessing that custom object. Unless you redeploy that custom object, you will not deploy the profile changes to that. So the access isn't changed. This is just really annoying to manage. If you deploy the whole profile, it's massive, and there's reason Salesforce doesn't just automatically do that. But you need to make sure that you're knowing what is in the profile that you're deploying, and that your changes and your permissions are being set properly. This is probably one example where if you are deploying in a way where you have access to the metadata, I would directly look at it a large percentage of the time, just to make sure that you're deploying the permissions you're expecting to deploy. General best practice, and something that Salesforce has started pushing over the last couple of years, is permission sets for access. Use profiles for IP restrictions and login hours and stuff like that, but for what objects do they have access to, what classes do they have access to, just use a permission set and then permission set groups to kind of bundle them together. That's a separate conversation, but it's something to think about when you have the opportunity. Another fun challenge you can hit is mismatched API versions. I think most of us, if not all of us, are aware that Salesforce does 3 releases a year. Every time they do a release, about half of the sandboxes are upgraded 4 weeks ahead of production. This is a really good way to test new features and see how your customizations will interact, see how they'll help your business potentially. But if your development sandbox is upgraded before production, all of your changes that you build and potentially test will be tied into that higher version. So you want to look at that, and when the sandbox preview announcement comes out, just like I said, there's a couple weeks before, 4 weeks before the release date. Take a look at your sandboxes that you're using and make sure you have a clean path to production that will remain on the version, the current version, that will not be upgraded. So that if you have a development, testing, staging, prod, make sure that you have development, test, and stage sandboxes that will not be upgraded. If you want an upgraded sandbox, use a different one. And one of the reasons to do this is pretty straightforward. If you're running a higher version in the sandbox where you're testing or developing than you are in production, you're not testing in a production-like environment. Anything that Salesforce has changed could impact how your new changes run. And if you're running in a different place, you might not find out how that interaction will happen until you're in production. You can also rely on, or you might accidentally rely on them and find that not only does it not work the way you expected, you're relying on a feature that doesn't actually exist. Any new components you make will also have the sandbox API version. So you might make a new Apex class with API version 53, try to deploy it to a 52 version production and have issues. This is especially a problem with communities. Again, we do a lot of communities. Every release cycle, there's a Slack message of someone who missed that this was happening, or a client who sandboxed, or someone who's new to communities saying, how do I deploy from a preview sandbox to a non-preview environment? And the sad fact is it's basically impossible. You really cannot deploy experience bundles very well from between environments. And it's a large thing that you don't want to manually recreate. There are workarounds. You can deploy pages, but it's just a mess and you want to avoid it. So make sure you know what version your sandboxes are when you're doing development and testing. Another fun thing that you run into often in production is unit tests. If you use CL data, stop. But if you use CL data or any tests that rely on data that is like setup data, they might run differently in different environments. So even if you run your unit test in your sandboxes, if it iterates over a list of users, a list of active users or users with valid email addresses, even if you don't use CL data, that list will be a different size in test than it will be in production. And so you might find that your tests fail or your code, exceeds CPU time or runs into problems because production has different data and different scale. The other thing is oftentimes people will run all tests, which is a good practice, certainly. But if you have a failure, if you have 1,000 unit tests and one of them fails, your deployment can't go. And you might be locked into running all tests for deployment if your individual classes are not at 75%. So if you run specified tests, you can pick a selection of tests to run and then make sure and then just deploy with that. And that will work as long as every class in your deployment hits 75% coverage. If you don't, you have to run all your tests. And so these are two really closely interrelated things that you need to make sure you're ready for. And the biggest thing to do is run your tests in every environment, but make sure that you know what tests you have to run and that those tests will pass. Also, tests will rely on validations that are not in Apex. This is very common with validation rules, where a lot of your tests are going to create test accounts. Someone makes a validation rule that says account name must be more than 5 characters. Your unit tests all make an account name test. Every unit test that makes an account is now failing. This is not that big of a deal on its own, but when you find out while deploying to production, it can be a nightmare and it can be a showstopper on a large release. It just is a thing that happens with the platform. So, and that actually gets to another common issue, the validation rule. Changes made directly in production. In effect, what happens when people make changes in production is your environments get out of sync. Your environments get out of sync, you get surprises. It is very hard in real world Salesforce environments to prevent any changes from happening in production. Very big enterprises, you certainly can, but most companies, or certainly many companies, have at least some path for some things to be done in production because there's admins running things who need to be able to make changes quickly, who aren't used to deployments. And part of the sales proposition for Salesforce is that you can easily and quickly make changes. And so how easy and quick is it to change a page layout if you have to go through 4 rounds of deployments and testing and everything to add a field to a layout? So these things will happen, and very often there will be things that get changed directly in production. Some of them can break your unit test. We said validation rules, custom settings, metadata, etc. Other ones might not break your unit tests, but if you deploy a page layout and your admins are used to changing page layouts in production, you're overwriting the entire page layout. All of their changes are gone. Everyone's sad. So this is a lot of friction can come from things happening in production that you weren't expecting to happen in production. And one fun note here, there's no way to revert deployments in Salesforce. There's no undo button. So if you push a page layout and the admin had just spent a week redesigning it and relaying it out to meet the user's needs, you've thrown away the work. The other thing that we can run into is manual deployment steps. We still, even with the new features with SFDX, we really don't have a deployment where everything can be automated, everything can be a click. We need to do some things manually. And especially on bigger deployments, we need to make sure we understand what these manual steps are. If you know that you need to deactivate this trigger because it's going to send all the test data you're doing for the data load, but you don't communicate that to someone, or someone else understands it, you can easily forget to do it or do it wrong, and that will impact your deployment. That will create problems. The other thing that we see a lot is we get something into the test environment, we're going through UAT, so user finds a bug that says, I can't access this field. crap, I forgot to change in the profile. I changed the profile, and then testing continues and everything's great. If you do that as a quick fix in UAT, you haven't gotten it into the deployment that's going to production. So you need to make sure that every time you fix a bug during UAT, you are integrating it into the change that will go to production. There's a few different ways of doing that, but you need to make sure that that change is covered. And again, you need to make sure that whatever manual instructions you have are clear and concise and can be interpreted by multiple people the same way. And then there's a few other fun technical surprises. By default, you can't deploy Apex classes which have jobs pending. So if you have a scheduled Apex class, you either have to unschedule it or change settings to deploy it. Approval processes, they don't always deploy the order of execution, so you can have multiple approval processes saying do this one, then this one, then this one. You may need to double check the order in production. The pick list fields, any values that aren't in the deployment that do exist in the new environment. So you may just say, I'm adding these 3 values. I'll write the XML myself. That's already a decision. And you push it up, you've inactivated all the other values on that field. And I think the bottom line is look at the metadata API. There's actually good documentation out there now. I gave a link to the specific article that I pulled these 3 from, which is, or 4, I guess, no 3, which has a list of some kind of hidden features, we'll say. But the documentation as a whole kind of gives you a lot of information about how different components deploy. So how should you deploy? And I think the truth is there's no right answer here. There's no one true way of Salesforce deployment. Above all, you want a controlled, repeatable process. You want to know that this is what you changed, this is how you changed it, and you could do it again tomorrow. This makes sure that you're testing what you think you're testing, that you're testing what goes to production, and that you're deploying what you think you're deploying, and that it's reliable and repeatable and safe. As we get more enterprises, one of the things that we push, that everyone's kind of looking at and pushing more, are the nice enterprise continuous integration tools. Touched on this a bit. They are fantastic. They give you a nice, really flexible UI. A lot of them are built on Salesforce, so you're used to it. You can integrate it with a lot of things. They can help automate certain manual tasks. Like Capado has a way of managing custom settings where you have environment variables and each environment has a different value. Capado can help manage that. I'm sure the others can too. I'm just not familiar with it. They have a built-in way of managing and tracking manual steps. So you deploy this package and then you need to go remove this and change this. Those are steps that you can assign to a person, that you can track the completion status per environment, and you can tie that to a story, to a deployment, and see everything together and have your steps where it's automated, manual, wait, person does it, continue. And then they usually have nice tools for automating things like unit test runs and commits or in checkouts and things like that. They're, like I said, we really like them. They come with some big downsides, cost being the obvious one. They're enterprise software. But even if you can afford it, they can be a bit heavy for a small team or an individual working in a single org. And that's where my hack-assed approach comes in. I can't recommend this, but I wanted to walk through it as it helps demonstrate how you can cover a couple bases and solve some of these problems. Again, I can't recommend this, but one thing I always like to have is a deployment workbook, and this is usually as simple as an Excel file with whatever steps and manual changes need to happen. So if it's anything more complicated than ant deploy package, I try to write it down in a list that is ideally accessible to people and understandable to someone that isn't just me. As I make changes, I track them in the package XML. I keep everything that I do within my IDE committed to or synced up with Git, and I commit as I go, and I get really frequent commits in a feature branch. And then at the end of my development, I make a pull request and I use the change log from that pull request and some multi-line edit in Sublime to generate a package XML with my config and my code changes. The benefit of doing that is if you're refactoring or making changes, it's easy to forget that you changed a specific Apex class. So you want to make sure that whatever you do, you track every class you change. My approach is to commit from my IDE and use version control. But whatever, make sure you have some solution to know, I changed this class, I made a quick change to this trigger, and I didn't forget it. When I work with an admin and they aren't comfortable kind of tracking changes and knowing what metadata types they use, I just have them make a change set. And most admins are familiar with it, but some people really like it. Some people obviously don't. But if they're comfortable doing that, I have them make a change set, track all of their changes in the change set. And then when they're done using the metadata API, like Ant or SFDX, I can retrieve the change set by name. So I pull the change set down. It gives me the package XML built from their selected components as well as the components themselves. And I can quickly merge that into mine. And so again, we're getting to a unified list of change components across different people retrieved from the environment. And then I do a final retrieve of that merged package XML, and that becomes the deployment. And the real benefit there is an org-to-org deployment, but I have all of the changes in a single set of files, and I deploy that same set of files to the test sandbox, to the staging sandbox, to the production sandbox. When we're going through UAT and we need to make a change, I can add those components to the package and repull and redeploy everything. And that helps us ensure that we're not making manual changes in UAT and then forgetting about them. And I have that set of changes ready to go. And we can always review it and, questions come up, audits, whatever. It's nice to have, this is what we actually push in a single place. So think about the problems this solves. Some of the things here might be helpful for you. But again, as a process, this is a mess. If you use change sets, you can do some things to use them more effectively. One thing is avoid big change sets, avoid big changes. Try to have frequent small deployments. It is much easier to manage a change set with 5 components than it is to manage one with 50. Make sure that you still have a way of tracking manual changes. Excel sheet, piece of paper if you're in person, but you want to make sure you can hand it off to someone else so that you know, okay, deploy this change set, make these 5 changes, and everything is still tracked and together. Make sure you have a consistent naming scheme for change sets. I tend to like ticket numbers, so I will do like ITC1234 as and that is my Jira ticket number, which would also be the name of my feature branch if I was doing that. But be prepared for multiple attempts. You don't want to see ITC1234, ITC1234 again, ITC1234, hopefully this time it works. Like, have a plan that it looks reasonable and you can see exactly how you went through it. For me, that's usually just putting a .1, .2, .3. And there's some useful Chrome extensions that can help with change sets as well. I haven't used the first one, but it was recommended and it seems like it should help kind of managing collecting components. But the second one that I've used a couple different types of components is some sort of auto refresher. This isn't just useful for change sets, but it is really nice when you're deploying in a hurry. You go to the environment, the change set's not there. You refresh a minute later, the change set's not there. There's plugins that you can automatically refresh your page every 15 seconds, say. And then it's just kind of running off on the side and you can watch for it when the component comes, or when the components are available to deploy. As we said, many environments either require or functionally require supporting changes in production. It's not good practice, but it's very common. So one thing that you can do is limiting the scope. Work with the admins, work with the business teams to say, these are changes that can be done directly in production. These are changes that we will only support making in a sandbox and deploying. And this way, every component has its own deployment path, as a consistent deployment path. So maybe admins need to change page layouts. Cool. You can change your page layouts in production. We will never deploy page layouts. And you just kind of live with that. If you need to add a component to a page, it's a manual change and a manual step in your deployment. You need to make sure you do live with it, because again, if they're changing in production and you're deploying from dev, those environments are out of sync and you're going to be stepping on each other. If you need to do a large change in that case, you can do a code freeze, and may not want to use that word depending on the context, but you can say, okay, we need to completely revamp this page layout. We're going to do this in a sandbox. Hey, admin team, you're not allowed to touch this page layout in production for the next 2 weeks, whatever. Refresh the sandbox, make your changes, deploy them, and then unlock it. And this is process driven, not technology driven. So you need to work with people and make sure you have a good working and communicating relationship, because you can't just lock a system admin out of changing a page layout or anything else. Frequently refresh the sandboxes. Even if you have clean deployment plans, if the admin is allowed to add, I was going to say validation rules. I've seen that. Please don't let your admins add validation rules in production on the fly. If the admin is allowed to add validation rules in production, you might be building something, whatever you're building either conflicts with the validation rule, or you're writing tests that don't account for it. You want to make sure your environments are as in sync as possible. Dev sandboxes can be refreshed daily. When I have one that's personal, refresh it all the time. Full sandboxes, you want to be refreshing at least a few times a year. And then have some way of automatically running your unit tests in production every night to help detect changes early. So you wake up one day, you get a report, you had 32 unit test failures. Oh, it's a validation rule. Oh, this workflow rule got deactivated. Oh, whatever. This is good practice anyway, but it's especially important if you have people making things that amount to code changes in production, because you don't want to find out that they broke everything when you go to deploy something. You want to know as soon as it happens so that you can find time to fix it. Again, touched on this a little bit. When you have manual deployment steps, I've said it 5 times, document everything. You should never have a deployment step that's just in your head. When you have a larger deployment, use a deployment workbook to track the steps, and have someone in the room or on the call whose job it is to go through the workbook and make sure every step is completed and make sure that it's marked as done and the right person is doing it. Everyone in the room should understand that they do what the workbook says. They do not do anything the workbook doesn't say, and they do not skip anything the workbook says to do. I don't care if you know that it's unnecessary or, oh, right, I just have to make this change quick. It happens all the time, but you might not remember the next time you do the deployment, and this needs to be a controlled and repeatable process. Again, assign every step to a person. I know Jeff is doing this. I know Nick is doing this. Make that person do it in every environment, especially in your test and production environments. You really want to follow the same process. You want to treat your test environment as kind of a practice run for production. And so make sure that anything you do in tests gets done the same in production. And then talking about fixing stuff in UAT. If you fixed something manually in UAT, I tend to write it down as a manual deployment step. If it is manually fixed in the test environment and not deployed, I manually fix it in production because I want things to be the same. If I can deploy it, I'd rather do that. But if I make a manual change in unit at the end of UAT, that manual change is going to the end of the deployment, because then I know I followed the same steps. And that's the only thing that I can take home to know that this deployment will work. Version control is another obviously very useful tool. I think we're all developers. We all have some understanding of how good it is. But I would say it's always nice to use and to have, and it's good to have a history of changes, even in an org-to-org deployment situation. Even if, kind of going back to the first slide, your version control is not your code base. It is not your source of truth. It is just notes that you keep of what's been done. It's a really effective set of notes. And so I like keeping commits going, even if they've got nothing to do with what's being deployed. Just know that they have nothing to do with what's being deployed. In most places, I think it's good to have a separate branch for production and other environments and a main or master branch. Main or master is what you think is the latest version of your code. It's what you think is in production. The production branch is what's actually in production. And you want to make sure that you know those and that you have an easy way of comparing them. And to help with that, make sure that your production branch has some sort of regular commit. I've seen a lot of people set up like nightly commits or weekly, whatever cycle you want, where they run a job that retrieves a package from production and commits it to the production branch. And that job doesn't know anything. It's just taking changes and committing them. But you can then occasionally compare the production branch to the master branch. And if they're different, something happened. And sometimes that's really obvious. Sometimes it's really common in the org. Sometimes it's a surprise. And I think the bottom line of all of this is no matter what you do, you can call Git the source of truth, but production is reality. And so you want to know if there's a difference between what you expect to be in production and what's actually in production and what your users are actually using. A few quick tips on unit tests. I said it was a story for another time, but regularly run all unit tests in production. Just as it's good to have a running commit of production, it's good to run unit tests nightly. I would have the same job, just do both every night. When you deploy to sandboxes, make sure you run tests. Don't say, oh, it's a quick deployment, I don't want to deal with this, they take too long. Run the tests when you go to sandbox, because you want as many opportunities as possible to detect that your production deployment is going to fail. Kind of touched on it. You try to ensure that every class individually meets code coverage, and ideally has a sister test class so that it's do thing, test do thing, or do thing test. And that way, you know one-to-one what tests you need to run. Every class will get 75% code coverage, and that lets you run specified tests when you do the deployment. Not only is it faster, it lets you focus on what's being deployed. And if you tie it to a nightly run of all local tests, you're not giving that much security to know, oh, this is what I'm deploying. Generally, it's nice to run related classes. So do thing might have 8 classes. Run all of the unit tests for do thing when you do the deployment. And then you'll be pretty confident that you're not breaking anything else. And if something does happen, you'll find out later that night, so you don't have a long downtime. Obviously, there are plenty of high-end enterprises where this is not a viable option. But to me, it's a good balance for most mid-sized companies of getting changes out there, not wasting your life in deployment, but finding issues quickly. Environments. You want to have, I think, 3 environments: dev, test, and prod. Dev is your playground. You can do whatever you want. You make your changes. You can refresh it every day if you want. You can have 5 of them. You just cycle through them. Test environment, when you go to test, treat it as a test run for production. As we've said, do the same steps, do it the same way. And then actually test it. Make sure the end users are testing, and validating the deployment, validating the changes so that you have confidence that it will work. And then it's really good to make sure that test has realistic data. So I would say either a full copy or use post-refresh steps, post-refresh Apex, to kind of generate some dummy data that at least structured like how your data is, so that users can go in and have a normal experience. And finally, change management. This is actually not quite finally, but this is something that we don't often think about as devs, and I just wanted to put it in there. Deployments, especially bigger deployments, are way more than the changes to the application. They're much bigger than the code changes. There's people involved, there's business processes involved, there might be integrations, content. Just make sure on any large project that there's a person who's thinking about that, and then make it their problem. And then finally, just some miscellany. One thing that I like to do, especially with frequent deployments, I mentioned you don't have an undo button, but you do have a lot of dev sandboxes. So just make one. Make a prod backup, make a dev sandbox, couple hours before your deployment, call it prod backup. I like a naming convention that has the date in it. Keep the last 12 or whatever. And then if something does change or break, or, oh shoot, we deployed over this and I didn't realize it was changed, you can go see what it was. And those prod backups only exist as a way of seeing things. Don't use them for development or changes or playgrounds, because then they're not a backup. And then another cool trick is you can use validate only deployments for off-hour releases. You can use it for anything, but it's especially nice for off-hour releases because it lets you confirm the changes are deployable and that your unit tests will pass during business hours. It lets you run long-running unit tests ahead of time, which helps you feel comfortable running more unit tests to make sure that there aren't any surprise interactions. And then you can hit quick deploy at the deployment window to make the changes and commit the changes without impacting users before that. It also looks cleaner. This is just kind of a side note, but if you make a bunch of small changes and they're failing as you're figuring out test coverage or missing components or anything, the deployment sheet just has a lot of red X's. Validation failures just show up as a note. They don't show up as an error, which if you're in a client org, it just looks cleaner and looks not quite as bad doesn't look quite like you don't know what you're doing. So that's everything. Probably a bit longer than it was supposed to be. Any questions?
No, that's perfect.